Come outside! They're gonna arrest me, bro. Come outside. They're bugging. I need to know my rights. I know you know them. Come outside for me, please, baby. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, he gave you everything.
What are my rights? Where are they? Where the f are they? I'm gonna sue the f out of y'all. I'm gonna sue the fuck out of y'all.
She was 18 years old. That matters. Not because youth excuses anything, but because it means she had her whole life ahead of her. Every choice still open, every door still unlocked. She had just gotten into a fight with her boyfriend. That happens. It happens to millions of people every day. An argument, raised voices, someone walks out, someone drives away. But on this particular night in Barnegat, New Jersey, driving away was the decision that changed everything. It was just past 1 o'clock in the morning. The streets were empty. The air was quiet. Most of the town was asleep. Stephanie Starr sat behind the wheel of her car, alone, upset, and by every measure that matters, in no condition to be driving. She did not see the flashing lights coming. She did not see the way the night was about to pivot. She did not understand, not yet, that the people trying to help her were already running out of options. This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about a teenager who made a series of decisions, each one smaller than the last, each one easier to rationalize than the one before, until the consequences became impossible to ignore. This is the story of one night in Barnegat, New Jersey, and how one wrong turn cost an 18-year-old girl far more than she ever imagined it would. Stay with me. Every story like this starts the same way. Normal. Completely unremarkably normal. It was a quiet evening in Ocean County, New Jersey. Barnegat is a township that most people outside of the state have never heard of. It sits tucked between the Garden State Parkway and the marshy edges of Barnegat Bay. It is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where the police officers work the same streets year after year, where a call coming in at 1 in the morning is enough to make everyone sit up a little straighter. Stephanie Starr was 18 years old. She was young enough that most of her life decisions were still being made on instinct and emotion, rather than experience and consequence. That is not a criticism. That is simply what it means to be 18. She had a boyfriend. She had a phone. She had a car. And on this particular night, she had a problem. Something had happened between her and her boyfriend. The details of what started the argument are secondary to the story. Couples fight, words get said, temperatures rise. People say things they do not mean, or sometimes things they mean too much. What matters is what came next. Stephanie got into her car. That was the first step, not yet the wrong one, not yet the decision that would define the night. Just a young woman, upset and emotional, looking for some distance from a situation that felt too close. Somewhere in the hours before that moment, she had been drinking. How much exactly would become a matter of legal record before the night was over? What we know is that by the time Stephanie got into the driver's seat, there were 4 small bottles of alcohol inside that vehicle. The kind of miniature single-serving bottles you see at gas station counters and airport shops. Small enough to seem harmless. Small enough to fit in a pocket or a cup holder without anyone making a big deal about it. Stephanie did not think it was a big deal either. That is the nature of impaired judgment. You do not know it is impaired. You feel fine. You feel frustrated and emotional and maybe a little reckless, but fine, capable, in control. She was not in control. But the night had barely begun. The argument with her boyfriend had apparently reached a point where someone in her life became genuinely concerned. Not just the low-level worry that comes with any disagreement. Real concern, the kind that makes someone pick up the phone and call for help. That call was already on its way to the Barnegat Township Police Department, and that call was about to set everything in motion. There are moments in a story like this where everything could have stopped. This was one of them. Stephanie Starr could have stayed where she was. She could have called a friend. She could have sat in a parking lot and let the night pass. She could have texted her boyfriend back and waited for things to cool down. She could have done 100 different things. She chose to drive. That decision, made in a matter of seconds while emotional and impaired and operating on instinct rather than reason, was the pivot point of the entire night. The miniature bottles of alcohol in her car tell a quiet story all on their own. Alcohol is a sedative. It slows reaction time. It distorts perception. It compresses the space between impulse and action. It makes people feel more confident than they are, more capable, more certain that they are handling things well even as the evidence around them says otherwise. Stephanie was 18 years old. Her brain, medically speaking, was not fully developed. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the human brain that weighs risk, anticipates consequence, and pumps the brakes on dangerous behavior, does not fully mature until a person is in their mid-20s. That is not an excuse. It is context. It is part of understanding how a young person can make a decision that in hindsight seems almost incomprehensible. She got behind the wheel. She pulled onto the road. And somewhere in that same window of time, a family member picked up the phone and dialed the non-emergency line for Barnegat Township Police. The caller was worried about Stephanie. They had reason to be. The dispatcher took the call. A welfare check was ordered. Officers were directed to locate the vehicle and make contact with Stephanie Starr to verify that she was safe. On paper, it was a routine call. In practice, it was the moment the night stopped being just a bad argument between a young couple and started becoming something with legal consequences attached. The officers who responded had no idea what they were heading into. They had a name, they had a vehicle description, they had a reason to be concerned, and they had a job to do. What they did not have was any way to know how the next several hours were going to unfold. The officers found her. It did not take long. Stephanie Starr was located by Barnegat Township Police in the early hours of the morning. The exact location was within the township's jurisdiction. The officers made their approach calmly and professionally. They were not there to arrest anyone. Not at first. This was a welfare check. Someone who loved Stephanie had called because they were worried about her. The officers were there to make sure she was okay. That was the whole mandate. Find her, talk to her, make sure she was safe. That was it. But as soon as they made contact, the situation shifted. Law enforcement officers are trained to use their senses. Not in some dramatic way. In a very practical, methodical way. They observe, they note, they catalog details automatically. And the details were there. The smell of alcohol was noticeable as soon as the officers got close to the vehicle. That changes everything about a welfare check. The moment an officer detects signs of intoxication in a driver, the call transforms. It stops being a welfare check and becomes something with much higher stakes. Because now there is a public safety issue. Because Stephanie had been driving. Because she was still behind the wheel of a car. The officers began asking questions. Had she been drinking? Where had she come from? Where was she going? The answers, or the lack of them, told their own story. And then came the moment that removed any remaining ambiguity. Inside the vehicle, in plain view, the officers discovered 4 miniature bottles of alcohol. Some of them had been opened. That detail matters enormously. An opened alcohol container in a vehicle in New Jersey is not just a curiosity. It is evidence. It tells the officers that alcohol was not merely present in the vehicle. It was being consumed in or around the time the vehicle was being operated. The picture was coming into focus. Stephanie Starr, 18 years old, had been driving a car while under the influence of alcohol with open containers in the vehicle late at night in a residential township. The welfare check was over. Something else entirely had just begun. What happened next was captured. Body camera footage and law enforcement recording documented the encounter in real time. That footage would later become part of the public record surrounding this case. Stephanie Starr did not cooperate. That is not a judgment. It is what the footage shows. A young woman visibly distressed, emotionally elevated, under the influence of alcohol in the middle of the night, surrounded by law enforcement. She was frightened, she was angry, she was overwhelmed. She started yelling. The demands came quickly and loudly. She wanted a lawyer. She said so repeatedly and forcefully. She refused to perform the standardized field sobriety tests. These are the roadside assessments that officers use to evaluate whether a driver is impaired. The walk and turn test, the one-leg stand test, following a pen light with the eyes. They are not perfect instruments, but they are established ones accepted by courts across the country as evidence of impairment. Stephanie refused all of it. She had that right. The right to refuse a field sobriety test is real, and it is legally protected. Refusing, however, does not make the situation go away. It does not erase the smell of alcohol. It does not make the open bottles in the back seat disappear. It does not reset the conversation. In New Jersey, refusing a breathalyzer test carries its own separate legal consequences. The state operates under what is called implied consent law. That means that by obtaining a driver's license in New Jersey, a driver has already legally agreed to submit to chemical testing if a law enforcement officer requests it under reasonable suspicion of impairment. Refusal is a violation in itself. Stephanie did not know this. Or if she did, it was not reaching her in that moment. Her boyfriend arrived at the scene. That detail is significant. He came. He tried to help. He tried to reason with her. The officers tried as well. At multiple points during the encounter, Stephanie was told directly and clearly what the path to going home looked like. Cooperate. Take the tests. Work with the officers. Go home. She could not get there. The combination of alcohol, emotion, fear, and youth created a kind of tunnel vision. She was not thinking about consequences. She was not calculating the odds. She was reacting, purely, completely, and loudly reacting. The yelling continued. The crying came. The back and forth went on long enough that anyone watching could see the outcome becoming inevitable. The officers had reached the end of their options, and the handcuffs were the only thing left. There is something about the fluorescent lighting of a police station that makes everything feel more real. The streets at 1 in the morning have a softness to them. Shadows and distance, a kind of unreality that alcohol amplifies. The world feels less consequential in the dark. Decisions feel less permanent. The station is different. Hard surfaces, bright lights, the sound of the building doing its job, phones ringing somewhere in the background, the low murmur of radio traffic, the smell of industrial cleaning product and old coffee. Stephanie Starr was brought into the Barnegat Township Police Department in handcuffs. She was processed. In law enforcement procedure, processing means a very specific set of steps. Belongings are collected and cataloged. Identity is confirmed. The charges being filed are formally documented. A record is created. A file is opened. The night, which had begun as a domestic disturbance and escalated into a traffic stop, was now leaving permanent marks on official government documents. Stephanie was placed in an interview setting. The officers who spoke with her were professional. That word gets used a lot, and it can sound clinical, but it matters here. They were not cruel. They were not punishing. They had a job to do, which was to document the facts of what had happened and ensure that the correct charges were filed against the correct person based on the correct evidence. They asked her questions. Where had she been drinking? Had she been driving the vehicle at any point that evening? Did she understand what she was being charged with? Stephanie was still upset, still emotional. That is understandable. Being arrested at 18 years old in the middle of the night after a fight with your boyfriend is not a small experience. It is terrifying and disorienting, and it carries with it a kind of shame that is hard to put into words. But the room does not pause for shame. The room does what it always does. It records. It listens. It waits. Officers have experience in this space. They have sat across from hundreds of people in exactly this condition. Young, scared, angry, regretful. They know how to wait. They know how to let the silence do its work. They know that eventually most people start talking. Stephanie talked. And what she said and what she did not say would become the foundation of the legal case that followed. The interview was not the end of the night. It was barely the middle. In the interview room, the story shifts. Outside in the street, everything was noise and emotion and confusion. In here, the facts become harder to avoid. The evidence does not go away simply because you refuse to look at it. The open bottles are logged. The smell is documented. The refusals are on record. Stephanie had requested a lawyer. That request was legitimate and legally protected. Under Miranda versus Arizona, a standard that has been the foundation of American criminal procedure since 1966, any person who has been taken into police custody has the right to have an attorney present during questioning. Invoking that right should, in theory, pause the questioning. But there is a distinction that matters here. Booking questions, the kind that establish basic identity and process the paperwork for filing charges, are generally not subject to the same restrictions. Officers can gather the information necessary to process an arrest even after a suspect has requested counsel. Stephanie was told what she was being charged with. The list was not short. She was told she was facing a DWI charge, driving while intoxicated. In New Jersey, this is not a minor traffic violation. It is a serious offense with mandatory minimums attached: license suspension, fines, possible ignition interlock requirements, the kind of charge that follows a person for years. She was also told about the breathalyzer refusal. In New Jersey, refusing to submit to a breathalyzer is a separate violation from the DWI itself. The penalties stack. They do not replace each other. A person charged with DWI and breathalyzer refusal faces the consequences of both simultaneously. Then there was the reckless driving charge. Reckless driving in New Jersey is defined as operating a motor vehicle in a manner that knowingly disregards a substantial and unjustifiable risk of causing injury or damage. Driving while impaired late at night in a residential community meets that threshold. And finally, the open container charge. The 4 miniature bottles, at least some of them opened, inside the vehicle. New Jersey law prohibits having an open container of alcohol in a motor vehicle on a public road. Period. Regardless of who opened it, regardless of when. 4 charges. Stephanie sat with all of that. There is a moment in these situations where the full weight of what has happened finally lands, where the numbers stop being abstract and start being real, where a person realizes that this is not going to be cleared up with a phone call or a good excuse. What Stephanie said in those moments, and what she chose not to say, reflected the state of a young woman who was beginning to understand the scope of what she was now facing. She had stopped yelling. That was something. The question now was whether it was enough. Let us step back from the room. Let us look at the case from the outside in. When law enforcement officers work a DWI case in New Jersey, they are not simply relying on their own impressions. They are building a record, a formal, documentable, admissible in court record that can survive the scrutiny of a defense attorney, a judge, and if necessary, a jury. The evidence in the Stephanie Starr case began accumulating from the moment the officers made contact with her vehicle. The officer's own testimony would form one layer of the case. They documented the smell of alcohol detected during initial contact. They documented Stephanie's behavior, her speech patterns, her coordination, her emotional state, all of which are relevant indicators of impairment in a DWI investigation. They documented the discoveries of the 4 miniature alcohol bottles inside the vehicle. In DWI cases, officers are also trained to note specific physical indicators: bloodshot or watery eyes, slurred speech, difficulty maintaining balance or following instructions, unusual or erratic behavior. Each of these is part of a standardized assessment that officers are trained and certified to conduct. The fact that Stephanie refused the field sobriety test meant that some of this documentation relied more heavily on officer observation than on standardized test results. But observation by a trained officer is itself a form of evidence. It is admissible, it is documented, and it is part of the official record. The physical evidence was clean and simple. 4 bottles, opened containers, present in the vehicle of the operator. The refusal of the breathalyzer was itself a documented fact that carries weight in New Jersey courts. The state's implied consent statute makes refusal a violation independent of the DWI charge, but it also creates a legal inference that jurors are allowed to draw that a person who refuses a breathalyzer test may have believed they would fail it. The officer's body camera footage documented the encounter. This is the modern reality of law enforcement cases. The camera is always there. It captures the moment of contact. It captures the back and forth. It captures the discovery of evidence. It captures the decision points, the moments where the path forward was explained, offered, declined. That footage does not lie. It does not remember wrong. It does not compress time or inflate drama or smooth over inconvenient details. It simply records. And in this case, what it recorded was thorough enough to support every charge that was eventually filed against Stephanie Starr. The investigation, such as it was in a case this straightforward, was largely complete before she ever sat down in the processing room. The question was never really whether the charges would stick. The question was, what would happen next? 4 charges. That is what Stephanie Starr walked out of the Barnegat Township Police Department facing on that night. Let us take them one at a time because each of them carries weight and each of them tells a part of the story. Driving while intoxicated. In New Jersey, a first offense, DWI, for a driver with a blood alcohol concentration or BAC between 0.08 and 0.10 carries a mandatory license suspension. The suspension ranges from 3 months to 1 year, depending on the specific back level at the time of the stop. For someone who refuses the breathalyzer, the court must determine impairment through other evidence which the officers in this case had documented thoroughly. A first offense, DWI in New Jersey also carries fines between $250 and $400, a $100 surcharge to the Drunk Driving Enforcement Fund, a $100 surcharge to the Alcohol Education Research and Enforcement Fund, and a $75 Safe Neighborhood Fund surcharge. On top of those are court costs, which vary, but are typically several $100s. Mandatory participation in an Intoxicated Driver Resource Center, or IDRC program. A mandatory ignition interlock device installed on any vehicle the person drives following restoration of their license, and insurance surcharges of $1,000 per year for 3 years. For an 18-year-old, this is not a small amount of money. Refusal to submit to chemical testing. This is a separate and independent charge. New Jersey's refusal statute carries its own mandatory penalties. For a first offense, refusal means an additional license revocation of 7 months to 1 year layered on top of whatever suspension the DWI charge carries. Additional fines, additional IDRC participation requirements, an ignition interlock requirement. The refusal charge does not replace the DWI charge. Both counts proceed simultaneously. Reckless driving. In New Jersey, reckless driving is a quasi-criminal offense. A first conviction carries up to 60 days in jail, a fine of up to $200, and up to 5 points on the driver's license. In the context of a it is often filed as a companion charge and can sometimes be negotiated during plea discussions. But it is on the record. It is real. Open container in motor vehicle. This is a traffic violation in New Jersey under Statute 39-4-51. It carries a fine of $200 for a first offense. It is the least severe of the 4 charges on its face, but it provides additional evidence of the pattern of behavior that forms the DWI case. It is not nothing. 4 charges, 4 separate legal consequences, 4 separate papers to sign, 4 separate boxes to check before any of this begins to resolve itself. And behind every one of them is a night. One night, one decision to get in the car. Stephanie was 18 years old when they handed her those tickets. She walked out of that station in the early hours of the morning with more legal problems than most people accumulate in a decade. The night was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Let us spend some time here. This is the part of the story that matters most. Not the charges, not the fines, not the license suspension. Those are consequences. They are important, but they are external. They can be resolved eventually through courts and attorneys and time. What happened inside that room and what the footage captures is something more revealing. Stephanie Starr was 18 years old and she was terrified. That is the core of what you see when you watch the encounter play out. Not defiance in the purest sense, not contempt for the law or malice toward the officers. Underneath every raised voice and every repeated demand for a lawyer was fear. Fear is not an excuse, but understanding fear is essential to understanding behavior. When a person is frightened and intoxicated at the same time, the brain's executive functions, the parts responsible for logical reasoning, consequence anticipation, and behavioral regulation, go largely offline. What takes over is the limbic system, the emotional brain, the part that is wired for survival and immediate threat response. Screaming, demanding, refusing, crying, arguing. These are not rational strategies. They are the behaviors of a brain in crisis, reaching for any tool available to make the situation stop. Stephanie's repeated demands for a lawyer are interesting from a psychological standpoint. She was right to want one. The request was legally sound and appropriately made. But the way the request was deployed loudly and repeatedly, and as a kind of shield against having to engage with anything else, suggests that it was functioning less as a legal strategy and more as an emotional anchor. If I keep saying this one thing, maybe the situation will change. The situation did not change. That is the hard truth of the interrogation room. The room is designed not to change. It is designed to be stable, predictable. The officers can wait indefinitely. They have done this before. They will do it again. The room has no stake in Stephanie's emotional temperature. It records what happens. It documents. It continues. There is a phenomenon that behavioral psychologists call the stress response cycle. When a person perceives a threat, the body and brain mobilize for action. Adrenaline floods the system. Heart rate increases. Breathing accelerates. The body wants to do something. Fight, flee, or freeze. Stephanie's response was somewhere between fight and flight. She was verbally combative. She was demanding. She was refusing to cooperate with a request that might have made her situation easier. And the alcohol still active in her system was amplifying all of it. Lowering inhibitions, increasing emotional reactivity, making the feelings bigger and the thoughts smaller. Her boyfriend, who was present at the scene and tried to intervene, represents an interesting thread in the psychology of the night. He tried to de-escalate. He tried to help her see that cooperation was her best path. She could not hear him. That is not a commentary on their relationship. It is a description of impairment. Alcohol does not selectively remove access to reason while preserving everything else. It removes the whole architecture of rational decision-making, and what is left is raw response. Raw response at 18 years old in the middle of a frightening situation, after a fight with the person you are closest to, looks exactly like what the footage shows. Loud, messy, exhausting, and ultimately completely counterproductive. The officers, to their credit, remain measured throughout. This is worth noting. They explained. They offered. They gave her information about what cooperation would mean for her. At multiple points, the path to a different outcome was described clearly and directly. You do this and you can go home. You cooperate and this gets easier. She could not get there. By the time the handcuffs came out, the decision had effectively made itself. The psychological toll of that night, the arrest, the processing, the formal charges, the magnitude of it finally landing would take time to work through. But time was something Stephanie now had in abundance. She was going to need it. Before we close this case, let us take a moment. Let us set aside the charges, the footage, the legal proceedings, and the official record. And let us talk about Stephanie Starr, not the defendant, not the subject of the body cam footage, not the name on the paperwork. Stephanie, she was 18 years old. That is not a number. That is a life, a specific, particular individual. Human life with its own history, its own relationships, its own dreams about what the future was supposed to look like. At 18, most people are still in the early chapters of figuring out who they are. They are making the kinds of mistakes that, if they are lucky, do not follow them forever. They are learning the difference between how they feel and what is actually true, between what they want in the moment and what they need in the long run. Stephanie had a family that cared about her. We know this because someone called the police out of genuine concern. Someone looked at the situation and decided that the most important thing was making sure Stephanie was safe. That phone call, the one that started this whole chain of events, was an act of love. Imperfect and complicated and with consequences no one anticipated. But love. She had a boyfriend. He came to the scene. He tried to help her. He stood there in the middle of the night and tried to reach through the fear and the alcohol and the defensive walls she had built around herself and offer her a way out. She had people who cared whether she made it through the night okay. That matters. Too often in cases like this, the person at the center of the story gets reduced to their worst moment, to the thing they did wrong, to the footage that went public, or the charges that got filed. They become a cautionary tale rather than a person, a symbol rather than a human being. Stephanie Starr was not a symbol. She was a teenager having the worst night of her young life, compounded by decisions she made while impaired, facing a storm of legal consequences she was not equipped to navigate alone. Whatever happened to her in the aftermath of that night, whether she found an attorney, whether the charges were reduced or fought or resolved through diversion, whether she lost her license and her insurance and had to rebuild her financial life from scratch. At 18 years old, she deserved the chance to learn from it, not to be defined by it. Every person who ends up in a police report began somewhere else. They were a child. They had a first day of school. They had something they loved before any of this happened. They had a version of themselves that existed before that night in Barnegat, New Jersey. Stephanie Starr is more than what happened on that road. She deserves the chance to become whoever she is still capable of being. We genuinely hope she found her way to that. This case is not unique. That is the hardest thing to say about it, and also the most important. Every single day in jurisdictions across the United States, young people get behind the wheel of a car when they should not. Every single day, law enforcement officers conduct welfare checks that turn into DWI stops. Every single day, someone refuses a breathalyzer test, not understanding what that refusal will cost them. Every single day, someone discovers, usually too late, that what felt like a manageable situation was actually a legal catastrophe in progress. The Stephanie Starr case is not remarkable because it is unusual. It is remarkable because it is ordinary, and ordinary means preventable. Let us talk about the alcohol first. Stephanie was 18 years old. In New Jersey, the legal drinking age is 21. She should not have had access to alcohol in the quantities she had consumed. This is worth acknowledging, not to place blame on those around her, but to recognize that underage drinking does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in social contexts that adults create and often implicitly permit. Conversations about alcohol and driving need to start long before a person gets their driver's license. They need to start before prom night, before the first college party, before the first time a teenager finds themselves at a gathering with a long drive home. They need to be specific and honest and repeated. Not just do not drink and drive, but here's what happens when you do. Here is what the night looks like. Here is the room you will sit in. Here is the list of charges you will carry. Here is the cost in money and in time and in freedom of that one decision. Let us talk about the refusal. Refusing a breathalyzer test is a legal right. It is also, in many cases, a legal trap. Most people do not understand that refusing a chemical test in New Jersey carries its own set of mandatory penalties, completely separate from the DWI charge. They think that by refusing, they are making the evidence harder to find. What they are actually doing is adding charges to the record, while the other evidence, the smell of alcohol, the open containers, the officer observations remains untouched. This is a conversation that needs to happen in driver's education classes, in high school health courses, in the materials that accompany a driver's license application. Young people need to understand, before they ever need to know it, what implied consent means in their state. Let us talk about cooperation. This is delicate territory because the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the right to refuse certain tests, these are fundamental and protected. No one should be pressured to abandon their legal rights. But there is a difference between exercising a right and allowing fear and impairment to drive behavior in a direction that makes everything worse. Stephanie's refusal to cooperate did not make the evidence disappear. Her yelling did not change the outcome. Her demands for a lawyer were legitimate, but the way they were deployed as a shield against all engagement did not serve her. Young people need to understand that there is a version of this night that ends differently, where you pull over, you stay calm, you are honest with the officers, and you call someone to come get you, where the night costs you embarrassment and maybe a conversation you would rather not have, but not your license, not thousands of dollars, not a record. That version of the night is always available, until it is not. Finally, let us talk about the community. Someone made a phone call. A family member worried about Stephanie reached out to law enforcement because they thought she might be in danger. That instinct was correct. That call in the most direct possible way is the reason Stephanie did not continue driving and potentially cause a crash. We do not talk enough about those calls, the ones made in the uncomfortable middle ground between wanting to protect someone and not wanting to get them in trouble. The calls that feel like betrayal and are actually the deepest form of care. If you know someone who is in danger of making a decision that could hurt themselves or someone else, make the call. Whatever the fallout, it is better than the alternative. It was just past 1 a.m. when the officers found Stephanie Starr. She had a whole life ahead of her. She still does. That is the hope that sits at the end of a story like this. Not a story about justice being served, though charges were filed and consequences were assigned. Not a story about a criminal caught, because Stephanie Starr was not a criminal in the traditional sense. She was a teenager who made a sequence of decisions that escalated one into the next until the consequences became impossible to avoid. She was 18 years old. She was scared. She was impaired. And she was learning in the most expensive way possible what the limits of those realities were. The body cam footage tells one version of the night. The official record tells another. What neither can capture is what happened inside Stephanie after it was all over. Whether she sat with it, whether she found someone to help her understand what it meant and how to move through it, whether the night became a turning point or simply a scar. We hope it was a turning point. We hope she looked at what it cost her in money and time and dignity and freedom and made a different calculation the next time the option to make a poor decision presented itself. We hope she reached out to the people who loved her, the ones who made the call, the boyfriend who came to the scene and stood there trying to help and let them in. We hope she got through it, because 18 is not a sentence. It is a starting point. The question this case leaves behind is not about Stephanie specifically. It is about all of us. It is about the decisions that happen in the gap between impulse and consequence. In the space between I feel fine and I am not fine. In the moment when someone reaches for their keys and a small voice says, wait, but does not say it loud enough. What do we do with that gap? Do we fill it with conversations before they are needed? With knowledge shared before there is a crisis? With communities and families who are present enough to notice when someone they love is heading toward the edge? Or do we wait for the blue lights in the rearview mirror? For Stephanie Starr, the choice was made. The night ended in a police station in Barnegat, New Jersey. But the rest of her story was still being written. Let us hope it is a good one. If you or someone you know is struggling with decisions around alcohol and driving, please reach out. Resources are available. Help is real, and the call you make before something happens is always easier than the call you make after. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if this kind of storytelling matters to you, and we will see you in the next one.